Someone sent me this slide, 10 achievements of communist China. Let's go over it and see how accurate it is. I'll be using two main sources for this, China's Political Economy in Modern Times by Kent Deng, a more academic source, and The Power of Capitalism by historian Rainer Ziedelman. This is better for laymen. Now, the first claim is under the Mao era, death from starvation was ended and caloric intake doubled. This is entirely untrue. They completely ignored the Great Famine, which was the worst man-made famine in human history. There's different estimates that Ziedelman cites. One says 32.5 million died, and one says 45 million died. Either way, that's a lot of starvation. As for caloric intake, it was lower under Mao than it was under the nationalists in the 30s. So no, Mao did not increase it. Life expectancy doubled, rising by 31 years, the fastest ever increase in any major country. Deng addresses this claim directly. Was there really an 84% increase in life expectancy? No. Deng points out that this data is completely at odds with all the other things we know about this era. Life expectancy was not great. Poverty was extremely high. There was virtually no access to healthcare. There was no way that life expectancy increased by this much. He points out that they get these statistics by disregarding really high infant mortality rates, and you just can't do that. It was more like an increase of 55% than 84%, but 55% is still quite high. But that's still uniquely high when compared to the other Asian countries. So why is this? Well, there was another thing unique about China, something we already covered, a huge famine where tens of millions of people died. In famines like this, the most vulnerable people are the ones who die first, the poorest people, the ones with less access to food, the ones with the worst health. So what happened is not that everyone's life expectancy increased, it's that the people with lower life expectancies died. The people with higher life expectancies survived, and thus the average life expectancy went up at an unusual rate. This isn't because life got so much better, it's because so many people died. The next claim is that literacy rates quadrupled, but there's no data given for this. We do know that private education was virtually non-existent, and government education was extremely underfunded and very poor quality, so there's no way this is true. The economy grew by 64% each decade. 70% of Mao's industrial growth depended on sheer volume of capital inputs. Mao's economy took an increasing amount of capital to produce the same output. So most of this growth came from using more inputs to produce the same amount of outputs. That's not a good thing. This growth was not reflecting improvements in the quality of life. From 1952 to 1978, growth in China's capital productivity and total factor productivity were both negative. When we did start to see genuine growth in China that did improve quality of life, this mostly came from the private sector, not from the Communist Party. In 2019, the private sector contributed to 60% of China's GDP, 70% of innovation, 80% of urban employment, and 90% of new jobs. And that's relevant to the next few slides, which talk about improvements after Mao. Improvements in GDP and declines in poverty, but all of this came after the reforms in the 70s and 80s. Right here, Ziedelman quotes a Chinese economist, Wei Yingzheng. China's reforms started with an all-powerful government under planned economy. The reason China was able to sustain its economic growth during the process of reform was because the government intervened less and the proportion of state-owned enterprises decreased, not the other way around. It was precisely the relaxation of government control that brought about market prices, sole proprietorships, town and village enterprises, private enterprises, foreign enterprises, and other non-state-owned entities. This was capitalism, not communism. This was the abandonment of the communist principles. This was a rebellion against the historical Communist Party. And speaking of the party, it doesn't matter that the party has more members than any political party in the world. China is a big country. As Dr. Zheng says, China's economic success was not because of the state, but in spite of the state. It was not because of the Communist Party or communist ideology, it was in spite of them.